Before we begin, I just want to apologize for calling Hakim a couple of times in my first video on him. That was dumb of me. But yes, tonight's commentary is once again on Hakim, specifically his video, Left Anti-Communism, an Infantile Disorder. Nice reference to Lenin there, credit where it's due. But what is left anti-communism, I hear you ask? Well, according to Hakim, it's this.
Left-wing anti-communism is a trend we see that simply dislikes and disregards almost every successful socialist experiment to have ever existed. Now, we can debate whether they were the true pure socialism trademark that the pure socialists have in their minds or not. That isn't the point. These were nonetheless experiments with no former grand blueprint or guide that attempted to organize society along lines different to capitalism. They were successful, in my opinion, in doing so, and genuinely stood as the greatest and most long-standing threat to global capitalism to this day. Even their memory stirs fear in the hearts of the ruling class, and that's why, to them, they must be demonized at every turn. However, the left-wing anti-communists will not only reject these experiments, or damn them as the monstrosities that perverted some pure socialism they've dreamt up, but in some cases claim that we don't have anything to learn from them, either. This trend is almost fully supported by the quote-unquote approved, meaning controlled opposition, leftist academics and writers that exist. The Noam Chomskys and the George Orwells of the world. Not only this, but the trend is fully supported by the capitalist establishment, with glowing reviews of books published, and runs and reruns of the books either by the CIAs or Harvards of the respective countries.
So right off the bat, I have one massive issue, and that's Hakim leaves out why exactly these people have criticized these socialist experiments. It's not because they didn't succeed in creating utopia, but because, to put it simply, they didn't feel like they were sufficiently leftist enough. Chomsky's issue with Lenin is something that, as he's pointed out before, many of Lenin's comrades had, which is that Lenin was just too right-wing for their taste, and consistently deviated from original Marxist thought.
So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won. But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism. The idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose. Now, that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution, if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. When he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And you could say they're defective instruments, they worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by the, in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists, and I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, it was a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism.
But, Marx would have turned over in his grave to see what they were doing. They were radically anti-Marxist, radically. But as long, like take, say, the way the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Trotsky, decided they had to drive the backward peasantry to industrialization by force in order to lead ultimately to a socialist society. I mean, the last 20 or 30 years of his life, Marx was working on peasant society in Russia. There were the Narodniks, the urban intellectuals went out to the countryside to collect information, to figure out how the peasants are living, and so on and so forth, try to assist them in things. And they collected tons of data. And Marx was just poring over the data. And he became convinced that there's real revolutionary potential in peasant society, peasant communes, peasant cooperative tradition, and so on. The urban socialists, both the Bolsheviks and the Social Democrats, literally suppressed all that work. It was just too inconsistent with their own class interests of controlling social movements. So that was gone. And the same is true across the board.
I also want to mention him saying that this is approved by the capitalist establishment because, well, I also think Chomsky had the best response to that.
And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons.
And by the way, Hakim, do you know what else is supported by the capitalist establishment? The mindless conflation of socialism with both the Soviet Union and Maoist China, and therefore both the worst economic policies of those nations and authoritarianism.
Now, of course, they called it socialism, but they also called it democracy. They were people's democracies, the purest form of democracy. They were socialism. The left, the West, the big propaganda system in the world, of course, just laughed at the democracy part, but it loved the socialism part, because that's a way to defame socialism. So if you think that the fall of the Soviet Union is a blow to socialism, you ought to also think on the same grounds that it's a blow to democracy. After all, they call themselves democracies too, so why isn't it a blow to democracy? Makes as much sense. It's only when it gets filtered through the Western propaganda system that it's not a blow to democracy, but it is a blow to socialism. But, there's absolutely no reason to play that game, whether you play it in dissent or in the nation or on the right or anywhere else. Expose it for the fraud that it is.
Of course, Hakim doesn't mind the Soviet Union's authoritarianism, calling the term itself meaningless while also saying that actions which are deemed it are sometimes necessary.
If anything, those in the Third World, by their personal experience, understand the necessity of nuance and the reasons for what some may deem authoritarian. A meaningless phrase, mind you.
And forgive me if I'm taking this a tad too literally, but the term authoritarian does have a meaning. Also, I'll get more into this as I continue the commentary, but just take note of how he doesn't say who these people are or why they'll say that, as it's quite possibly my biggest issue with the video. Side note, immediately after the part I played, Hakim accuses these left anti-communists of blindly praising Russia in the first couple of years after the revolution.
If you've read enough literature on the Bolshevik Revolution, for example, you'd quickly notice the pattern of lionizing the first few years of the revolution, up until maybe 1922 or 23, and then afterwards, severe condemnation.
But we just heard Chomsky condemn both early actions taken by the Leninist government and even early examples of Lenin's theory. Now, I will concede Orwell did have this habit, just as he, as Hakim accuses him of, gasp, criticized the Soviet Union while Nazi Germany existed.
This is the criticism honest Marxists take part in, unlike the eternal traitors of our movement such as Orwell, who attacked the Soviet Union at the height of its war against the fascist menace.
I just love the way Hakim phrases that. He doesn't say, for example, that Orwell criticized the Soviet Union while his country was allied with them during a literal world war. Said alliance being so tight, by the way, that Orwell had to write Animal Farm as he did because he was not allowed to publish a non-fiction expose about the actions of Joseph Stalin. And again, Orwell's criticism of the Soviet Union was never that it wasn't a utopia, but that it wasn't socialist. In his original preface to Animal Farm, he wrote, "I have never visited Russia, and my knowledge of it consists only of what can be learned by reading books and newspapers. Even if I had the power, I would not wish to interfere in Soviet domestic affairs. I would not condemn Stalin and his associates merely for their barbaric and undemocratic methods. It is quite possible that, even with the best intentions, they could not have acted otherwise under the conditions prevailing there. But, on the other hand, it was of the utmost importance to me that the people in Western Europe should see the Soviet regime for what it really was. Since 1930, I had seen little evidence the USSR was progressing towards anything that one could truly call socialism. On the contrary, I was struck by clear signs of its transformation into a hierarchical society in which the rulers have no more reason to give up their power than any other ruling class. Moreover, the workers and intelligentsia in a country like England cannot understand the USSR of today is altogether different from what it was in 1917. It is partly that they do not want to understand, i.e. that they want to believe that somewhere a really socialist country does actually exist, and partly that, being accustomed to comparative freedom and moderation in public life, totalitarianism is completely incomprehensible to them. Animal Farm, of course, being the book the John Birch Society attempted to have banned from public schools in the 1960s because they viewed it as pro-communist. One should also easily notice how good faith George Orwell was, and how he, it seems, went out of his way to give the USSR the benefit of the doubt, and take into account the circumstances it was placed in. I mention this because Hakim says that criticism of these socialist states needs to be based on that.
This is not to say you cannot criticize those experiments. Far from it. They should be criticized. But there's a time, place, and format this criticism must take place in, and that criticism must be based in evidence and good faith. It must be grounded in nuance and an understanding of the circumstances.
As if these were debate opponents and not political leaders whose mistakes could cause the suffering and death of untold thousands. However, he doesn't explain how either Chomsky or Orwell's criticisms actually fall into this category. Instead, it just calls them anti-communist, which, as I just established, is not true, and then moves on. Instead, all we get is this vague gesturing about how, among other things, if the Russian Revolution had gone the way these people wanted, the communist government would have fallen, and they'd be praising it.
Had the revolution failed by 1923, ironically, by the very steps they wished the revolution would take instead, they'd be praising it to the heavens to this day. But no, the revolution did not fail then.
Which, yeah, I guess if they're anti-communist and the Russian Revolution succeed in establishing communism, then ideally they would want the revolution to have failed. What fucking kind of point are you even making? This is followed up with him declaring that if a Marxist revolution were to take place in his home country of Iraq, unspecific things would need to be done which unspecific Western leftists would not like, and therefore said Western leftists would be against it.
In my own country of Iraq, a socialist revolution would do more than enough to offend the sensibilities of our misguided Western comrades. The things that need to be done would have to be done harshly, swiftly, and with the local shortages and issues taken into account. This would result in a socialism that, although imperfect, as humanity is itself, will result in a net positive for people's lives and their children's lives. This is more than enough for the left-wing anti-communists to damn this hypothetical in its cradle.
You know, for somebody who consistently preaches the importance of nuance, you are incredibly comfortable making these very vague blanket statements. What steps are you talking about? Who would they offend? Besides just generic Western leftists. But what branch of leftism are we talking about? Are we talking Marxist-Leninism, anarcho-communism, democratic socialism, Trotskyism? And furthermore, why would they be offended by this? And what would their solution to the problem be? You don't answer any of that. Instead, you just conduct this hypothetical scenario where mean old Western leftists are against this because it would improve the material conditions, but do so in unspecific ways they don't like. Of course, according to Hakim, this is because unspecific experiments in socialism done by unspecific black and brown people are condemned immediately by unspecific white Western leftists.
The question of racism cannot be ignored. If you've paid attention, you'd quickly notice how the condemnation of third world black and brown experiments are almost immediate.
A point which honestly would be more valid if his main example so far hadn't been criticism of the Soviet Union, which was not primarily governed by black and brown people. The Soviet bloc was in Eastern Europe. I'm sorry, I cannot stress how much this video falls apart because of the sheer amount of blanket statements Hakim makes. At one point, he mocks critics of unspecific Marxist revolutions because they couldn't create the perfect revolution and the perfect socialism. They can't even organize a reading circle.
If this does not absolve them, then I'll sit back and await the eternal wisdom of these new comrades to establish the perfect revolution with its perfect socialism. Interesting that the groups that can't organize a reading circle think they're capable of this.
But are they claiming they can? Again, most of the criticism I've seen of these experiments is not that they're not perfect socialism, but that they're just not socialism. He asks where their contributions to leftist theory are.
There must be some substance to their criticism. They clearly paint themselves as knowing better. They should have done this, they should have done that, it abounds in their rhetoric. If that's the case, where are their revolutions? Where are their contributions to Marxist theory? Where are their organizations?
Yes, where are Noam Chomsky's contributions to leftist thought? It really is a mystery. Anyway, final thoughts. I don't really have anything else to say other than Hakim was so unspecific in this video that I genuinely have no idea who he was talking about a lot of the time. And when he did give names, he almost consistently misunderstood what those people have said. Good night and good luck.